Some of you no doubt know of the festival Walpurgisnacht, or Hexennacht, Witches' Night and Hex Night respectively. Although celebrated throughout many European countries, this festival had its origin in Germany. Unlike other German traditions, mostly associated with Christians, Walpurgisnacht did not make the trip over to the Atlantic, to the American Midwest and southern Ontario. Perhaps this was because it was too foreign, and could not be adequately sanitized by immigrants, or perhaps it was just seen as evil. I am quite certain that Walpurgisnacht is celebrated by many in North America, now with the rise of paganism among edgelords and former Goths. I digress. That is not what I wish to speak about in this thread. Last year, as I was completing my studies in second year, I decided to take a trip to Germany. My family originally comes from Germany, when my Oma came over with her parents and brothers in the 1950s, following the war. I had never managed to learn German through my family, but I had grown quite proficient since taking classes of it in university. Several members of my extended family still live in Germany, or Tante as it's known in German. They live near the city of Stuttgart, which is relatively close to the Black Forest, the Schwarzwald. That's where the story takes place. Upon completing my last exam in April, I immediately booked a flight to Stuttgart airport using money I'd earned from a summer job I held a year before. Upon reaching the airport in the evening, my Tante picked me up in her slightly ancient Passat, and we drove to her house. The house sits in the countryside of Baden-Württemberg. I use quotations because in a country as small as Germany, compared to my native Canada, you're never far from civilization. Nevertheless, the view was quite spectacular as the sun set. I spent the night and early morning talking with my Tante and her husband, and when it was time to retire, I was shown to one of my cousin's old rooms. Tante's children had long since grown up and raised families of their own. She and uncle, were both in their late 60s at the time. The room was musty and clearly hadn't been used in many years, let alone even entered. My cousin's possessions had been removed and only a bed, kitted out in those standard thick floral comforters early couples put on beds, and a night table. Despite being in a foreign country and the continent of Europe for the first time, I was at ease. The house was built in the 1850s by my upteenth great-grandfather. It had survived for over 150 years of starvation and war, and almost seemed to assure me with its hardy wood and stone construction that it would protect me too. But you can't bring a house with you. The day of April 29th, my Tante asked me if I wanted to go to the city and celebrate Walpurgisnacht. I had no idea what this was, and so asked her about it. It's an old festival, only lasting one of the nights, unlike Carnival, which is a week. In medieval times, it was when the witches would come together and perform rituals. Nowadays, it's just an excuse to drink and for the leftists to cause trouble. I'd yet to find a good excuse to drink in Germany, although it was a daily institution. I resolved to take part in Walpurgisnacht and perhaps acquire some blonde pussy. So, it was the night of April 30th, and the morning of May 1st last year that I brushed fates with evil forces working their machinations under our noses. At around 10 p.m. on April 30th, I went to Stuttgart and out onto the street. It was full of people dressed up as monsters and devils and witches, and there was also a fair amount of rioters dressed in all black. They were throwing flares and knocking trash cans over. The Polizei had yet to arrive, which they would soon. While I was trying to navigate the streets and get my bearings, I bumped into a young man who turned around with a look of worry on his face, which soon perked into a smile. He said in German, "Hey, how are you liking this?" I told him it was very exciting and asked him if he knew where I could get a beer. He called out, "Andrea!" to a brown-haired girl which was further into the crowd wearing a backpack. She hustled over and the man told her to give me a beer. She opened her backpack and handed me some kind of Bavarian lager. "That'll be €5. I opened my wallet and gave her a €5 note and struck up a conversation with the guy. He was my age and he was called Johannes, and Andrea was his girlfriend. As time wore on and music blared into the streets, the Polizei began quelling the streets. Andrea remarked that the scene had gone stale and wished to leave. I asked Johannes if I could tag along and he let me. We get into his BMW and started driving away from Stuttgart into the night. I didn't care where we were going as I was getting extremely drunk. Andrea had stopped charging me for beers at this point. I eventually realized that we had been driving for some time and were getting into side roads. I asked Johannes where we were headed. "Schwarzwald. It's where the witches are convening tonight. We should catch them in the act." I was never one to believe in witches, so I believed we were going into the woods just to make mischief. What did unnerve me, however, was that the Black Forest is infamous for just that, being black. The trees are so thick that the sun can barely get through most places. At night, it would be impossible to see assuredly. I told Johannes and Andrea about my concerns, and they simply laughed them off. "We can use our phones for light. Right, as if that ever works in the movies. To be clear, I was not afraid of what was in the forest, but the forest itself. I did not want to trip on the mountain's terrain and hurt myself in the pitch black darkness. Despite knowing all about the fairy tales inspired by the Black Forest, I was sure that nothing went on in there besides littering and sex. The BMW drove down the side roads, and the countryside gradually fell away to an increasingly foreboding tree line, and soon enough we were on a dirt road into the forest. Andrea turned off the music, and we listened to the branches smack the car as we drove deeper in. We continued along for around 20 more minutes before coming to a stop, with Johannes ushering us out. Now, the fun begins. Let's catch some witches. We turned on our phone flashlights and stepped out onto the dirt path on foot, clambering over rocks and mounds. The three of us had no particular destination. We just roamed aimlessly into the interior of the Schwarzwald, stumbling around as drunken fools. I was on my 4th beer by this time, and in a moment of clarity, began to wonder why I proceeded to leave the relative safety of Stuttgart and accompany 2 complete strangers who were supplying me with alcohol into a dark forest. Truly, this was something I should have thought of an hour beforehand. Andrea, more beer. These are your last ones, Johannes. There are only 2 left for me and Anon. We got bored with simply walking around and listening to each other slurp beer, so we started making jokes and talking about ourselves. They both laughed when I said I was from Canada. Why come to Germany then? This place is shit, my friend. I would like to go to Canada, switch lives. We began making quite a lot of noise and started howling into the trees, perhaps beckoning some animal to come and entertain us. The time seemed to drag on. I checked my phone and only 30 minutes had passed since we started walking. Johannes was getting a bit angry that we hadn't found another living soul in the Black Forest at midnight. Though, I wonder why he expected to see anything else. What a load of fucking crap. There's nothing here. The beer sucks and now I have none left. He crumpled his can and made a running throw. It landed a few feet in front of him, and he tripped over himself onto the slope of a high mound. He swore to himself under Andrea shushing him. Listen. I strained my ears. What I heard was unmistakable. Chanting. I checked my phone to make sure no audio was playing. Johannes and Andrea did the same. The 3 of us looked at each other wide-eyed and turned off our lights. When we did this, we noticed an orange aura emanating from behind the mound Johannes slipped on. Andrea beckoned Johannes and I to see what unnatural thing was there. The 2 of us inched up the hill until we could see over, and what we saw was indeed unnatural. 5 women, dressed in rags, were hopping and bouncing around a bonfire set in the clearing of trees, waving their arms like lunatics and shouting in unison. One woman, an old crone, was seated in front of the fire with the carcass of some animal, and was waving her arms over it in a ritual-like fashion. The shadows that protrude out of these women as they danced around were even more frightening than the women themselves. Johannes and I slid down the hill after a few seconds of staring. Holy fuck, Jesus Christ, Andrea. Johannes whispered shouted to her. What? Witches? I didn't want to admit what I was thinking, but Johannes said it for me. We finally found them. Fuck yes. I'm gonna go piss on that cunt's fire. I was dumbfounded that Johannes believed these women were modern paganists that were celebrating their version of Christmas. Even more so that he wanted to screw with them. Andrea had to take a look for herself and climb on the top of the hill. After a few seconds of observing, she slid down. Let's do it. I didn't know what to do or say, as I'd never interrupted a fucking ritual in a deep forest at midnight before. Maybe this was another German tradition, I joked to myself. The 2 of them climbed back up the hill and then looked down upon me, motioning for me to come up with them. Once I had done so, reluctantly, the 2 of them slid down on their rear ends, yelling out. I only watched from the top of the hill. Aha, we caught you bitches. Now, suck my cock, Johannes decreed. He was clearly drunk. The old crone stopped her chanting and turned around to face Johannes and Andrea. The 5 other women continued prancing around the fire, calling out ghastly shrieks from their throats. The old one pointed a finger at Johannes and Andrea and then spoke with a sandpaper voice. We were beginning to think that this night would be much like the past ones, sacrificing a lesser beast in place of a soul. But now you 2 have come to our home and presented yourselves so finely. My blood drained at this point. This was clearly not a reenactment or a harmless celebration. This was the real McCoy. If you have ever been in a situation where a fight breaks out at a party, you have to run despite being drunk, and the alcohol ceases to have any effect on your motor and cognitive skills, you know what I felt there. I was still drunk, however, and shouted out to Johannes and Andrea to get back up the hill. The crone looked up at me, and her eyes lit up with yellow flickers, even as she sat facing away from the fire. The women continued to leap around the fire, seemingly at a faster pace now. 3, cried the crone, and she began to cackle, a true cackle from deep within a black heart. Andrea looked up at me from below and told me to come down. As she was saying this, one of the witches circling around the fire stepped slightly out of her rhythm and grabbed Andrea's arm, pulling her in. Andrea yelped out and tried to get away. "She has my arm! She has my arm, Johannes! Help me!" Johannes stood there like an absolute dumb fuck. He probably thought it was still a joke. Andrea was then thrown into the fire. It was very quick, and if I blinked I would have missed it. The witch simply hurled Andrea into the bonfire. She didn't die immediately, of course. Flames take some time to kill. Normally, the lack of oxygen would kill someone in a fire, but this was an open air, so Andrea was left to squirm and cry on top of the bonfire. It also seemed like she had been partially impaled by one of the large branches making up the fire. Upon seeing his girlfriend get tossed into the fire, Johannes came to the realization that I had. This was actually happening. The witches were taking advantage of the fact that we were drunk and didn't know where we were. I shouted to Johannes, "Get the fuck up here!" He began desperately scrambling up the hill back towards me, and I pulled him over the top. We both slid down to the forest floor. "We have to go now," I told him. The shock was beginning to affect him. We darted off back into the darkness, instinctively keeping close with each other. The witches were clearly in pursuit because we heard shrill, banshee shrieks echoing after us as we fled for our lives. We hadn't turned on our phone flashlights, so we were running into absolute nothingness. And I mean nothing. I could not see anything at all, and the alcohol was definitely not helping. A few times as we ran, I heard footsteps pattering quickly on the ground next to us. I didn't dare to look back, lest I was able to see what was going on. Johannes and I ran, and ran for what seemed like an eternity. This is probably the least interesting part of the story, since there's no way to accurately describe the feeling of absolute survival instinct pumping into you. The urge to get away was so strong, I did not notice that Johannes was not at my side anymore. He was gone, and I feared the worst, that one of those inhumanly strong witches had picked him up too. I stopped running, and quickly pulled out my phone, turning on the light, scanning all around to see if I could find him. Then I heard someone calling me, "Anon!" I followed the calls of my name and shouted back, "Yes, I'm here! Don't leave!" I desperately sprinted towards that voice, and the phone lit up the face of my Tante in intermittent flashes as my arm swung up and down. "Tante, we need to get out of here." "Yes, come here." "What have you been doing?" I ran up to her and tried to explain what just happened in my short breath. She just cooed and stroked my hair. I stood there for a couple of seconds until I found this behavior of hers uncomfortable. I stepped back and yelled as loud as I could, "Who or what the fuck are you?" My Tante lunged towards me with sharp claws and tore my shirt down my chest, and took some skin off with it too. The fabric flattered away and my necklace was exposed. Tante hurled back a shriek and morphed into the old crone I saw at the bonfire, and it looked at me with wild and angry eyes. You see, on my necklace, which is made of silver, hung a crucifix, which I received on the day of my confirmation. It was made of onyx and had the Lord's Prayer inscribed onto it. To this day, I believe that is what saved me at that moment. The crone sputtered out some piggish language that certainly was not German or English, or any language I knew, and started to back away while hunched down. I pulled my necklace off and wrapped it around my fist, and shone my light directly at the crone. I extended my arm on towards the crone, brandishing the cross. "Get back! I'm not a Catholic, or else I would have been reciting some Latin," but I began speaking the Lord's Prayer in both English and German as I kept pushing the witch back. It seemed she had enough after 2 minutes of this, as she turned on her heel and sped off. I followed her with my light and watched as within 5 seconds, she disappeared far off into the trees at a devilish speed. I heard Johannes' voice behind me. "Oh, thank God I found you. If you didn't make that racket, then I don't know I would have." Having just been attacked by a shape-shifting witch, I whipped my arm around and smacked Johannes with my necklace. He cursed and slapped my arm away, asking what the fuck I was doing. He was the real Johannes. We both resolved to continue running, in any direction, and to hold hands as we went. Gay and or / awkward? Not in a situation like this. The two of us ran slower this time, and eventually simmered to a walk down as the sun rose, and we could start seeing the way in front of us again. We were very fortunate to happen across a small hamlet tucked inside the trees. We ran up the door of the largest house, which was very ancient, and still had a straw roof, and banged on it. Soon a tall man with grey stubble appeared, and led us inside after we exclaimed at him, "Witches." The man, who I later learned was named Lucas, quickly appraised our condition, and laid Johannes down on the kitchen in the den. He then brought me to the kitchen table and sat down with me. He quizzed me intensely on the details of the night over a cup of coffee. I didn't begin to question why he was so interested and helpful. As I was coming down off my adrenaline high, he leaned back in his chair and murmured when I told him about Andrea. I asked him what he was concerned about, and he told me, "It's no secret to the people who live in this forest, and now yourself, that there are unnatural beings lurking out there. Once these witches were strong and held domain over a grand lot of this forest. With the rise of industrialization and fast transport, they had began lacking in humans to feed off of. They had been feeding on animals every Hexennacht for at least a century now. It was our hope that they would have died away in time. With the death of your friend Andrea, it seems they will be around for a lot longer indeed." Lucas was very kind to Johannes and I, and allowed us to stay until we could arrange a way home. Johannes left later in the morning as Andrea's mother came to pick him up, and my tante and uncle came around soon. I repeated the story I told Lucas to them, and they did not necessarily believe me, though they knew I had been disturbed greatly. I decided to leave the country as quickly as humanly possible, and booked a flight out of Stuttgart for later that night. It was a long, plane ride home, but the feeling of being back in my own home was more than worth it. Let this be a cautionary tale to anyone who believes that fairy tales, or European folklore in general, is unfounded. I and Johannes are living examples of people who've brushed with these demons deep inside the foreboding Schwarzwald. And that is the end of the story, my friends. Hopefully someone will screenshot it and it makes an appearance in other threads, since it's most likely one of the only true stories on this board.